Everyone learns the same story. Brutus killed Caesar to save Rome from a tyrant. That story is a lie. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, 60 senators stabbed their own benefactor 23 times. Men Caesar had pardoned. Men Caesar had promoted. Men Caesar had made rich. They didn't kill him because he was dangerous. They killed him because he refused to pretend. And in a system built entirely on pretense, that refusal was a death sentence. Here is the question nobody asks. What exactly was Caesar supposed to be pretending? And why did stopping that pretense require 23 knives? That is what this video is actually about. Before Caesar, Rome had spent 2 centuries conquering the Mediterranean. Enormous wealth flooded in, and it did not distribute evenly. A few hundred Senate families absorbed most of it. Ordinary Roman farmers lost their land. Soldiers swore loyalty to their generals rather than to the state. By the time Caesar was born, 2 men, Marius and Sulla, had already marched private armies on Rome itself. The Republic's rules had already been broken, openly, repeatedly, by the men who claimed to be defending them. Caesar didn't create the crisis. He inherited it. And then he refused to pretend it wasn't there. The Roman Republic was, in theory, a system of shared power. 2 consuls elected annually. A senate of several hundred members. Checks and balances designed to prevent any single man from becoming too powerful. In practice, by Caesar's time, it had become something else entirely. Think of it like a large corporation that still holds shareholder meetings, still publishes annual reports, still follows all the formal procedures, but where every important decision has already been made in private by the same 10 families before the meeting starts. The procedures are real. The power is not shared. That is what the Roman Republic had become. A performance of legitimacy maintained by people whose actual power depended on nobody looking too closely at the performance. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, each of them had already bent the Republic to breaking point. Each had marched armies on Rome, rewritten the rules, done things the Constitution said were impossible. But, and this is crucial, they all maintained the fiction afterward. They held elections they had rigged. They consulted a Senate they had packed. They wore the costume. Caesar's fatal mistake, if you want to call it that, was taking the costume off. Here is what made Caesar different from every Roman strongman before him. He sat when the Senate entered the room, a deliberate violation of protocol so obvious that every senator present understood exactly what it meant. He allowed people to call him king in public while technically refusing the title. He accepted the dictatorship for life, an office that had always been limited to 6 months of emergency power. He put his own face on coins while still alive, something no Roman had ever done. He was not hiding what he was. He was saying, clearly, to anyone paying attention, "The Republic is over. I am what comes next. Deal with it." Now here is the question you have to ask honestly. Was Caesar wrong? Were the elections actually free? Were the Senate's decisions actually shaping Roman policy? Or had it all been performance for decades, and Caesar was simply the first person powerful enough to say so out loud? The answer, if you look at the evidence, is that Caesar was right. Everyone in the Senate knew the Republic had been dead in everything but name since at least Sulla's dictatorship 40 years earlier. They just needed everyone else to keep pretending otherwise. Caesar ended the pretense. And the men whose entire identity depended on that pretense had only one possible response. Let's do what the textbooks never do. Let's look at each of the key players individually, not as heroes or villains, but as people with their own logic and their own fears. Because this is where the story gets complicated. And complexity is where the truth lives. Start with Brutus. Marcus Junius Brutus is the hardest to understand because he is genuinely not a villain. He was a philosopher, a man of real principle, someone who had thought seriously about what the Republic meant and what it was worth. Caesar had pardoned him after the Civil War, not just spared him, but promoted him, given him a prestigious governorship, treated him with consistent warmth. By most accounts, Caesar genuinely loved Brutus. So why did Brutus raise a knife? Because he believed, genuinely, not as a cover story, that killing Caesar would restore the Republic. He wasn't performing. He was catastrophically wrong. The Republic he was trying to restore had been gone for decades. He was attempting to resurrect something that had already died before he was born. The tragedy of Brutus is not that he was a bad man. It is that he was a good man acting on a completely false premise.
Now look at Cassius. Gaius Cassius Longinus is the opposite of Brutus in almost every way. Where Brutus was a philosopher, Cassius was a politician. Where Brutus was motivated by principle, Cassius was motivated by wounded pride and personal grievance, and he was at least partially honest about this. He had expected a military command that Caesar gave to someone else. He resented Caesar's success with an intensity that he dressed up in Republican language, but that everyone around him could see was something more personal. He recruited Brutus specifically because he understood that the conspiracy needed Brutus's moral credibility. Without the most respected man in Rome standing behind it, the assassination would look like what it partly was: jealousy wearing a toga. Then there is Cicero. He was not in the room. He didn't raise a knife. But he was the spiritual architect of everything that happened. He was the voice of the old Republic, genuinely brilliant, genuinely committed to its values, and genuinely unable to function in a world where those values no longer determined who held power. For Cicero, Caesar's rise was not just a political defeat. It was an existential crisis. Because if Caesar was right, if the Republic really was already dead, then everything Cicero had devoted his life to was a beautiful lie. He could not accept that. So he chose to believe that killing Caesar would make it untrue. He was wrong. Mark Antony had him killed 2 years after the Ides of March. His hands were nailed to the Senate door as a message about what happened to people who thought words could stop power. And finally, Caesar himself. He knew. The soothsayer had warned him about the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had a nightmare and begged him not to go. He had initially agreed to stay home. Then one of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, came to his house and talked him out of it. Told him the Senate was ready to offer him a crown, that it would look weak to stay away. Caesar went. Why? Because he had made a consistent choice his entire life to act from strength rather than fear. He had crossed the Rubicon when everyone said it was suicide. He had granted clemency to his enemies when every military instinct said eliminate them. He was not reckless. He was a man who had decided, over and over, that living in fear was worse than whatever came next. On the Ides of March, he made that choice one final time. I want to spend a moment on one specific scene. At the festival of Lupercalia in February of 44 BC, just weeks before the assassination, Mark Antony 3 times placed a crown on Caesar's head. And 3 times Caesar removed it, to the cheers of the crowd. The crowd cheered every refusal. The senators watched with iron faces. Everyone in that square understood what was happening. This was theater, a test to see whether the Roman people would accept a king. And when the crowd cheered each time Caesar removed the crown, he was reading the data. Rome will accept the reality of one-man rule, but not the name of it. He later told people he wished he had accepted. Think about what that means. The refusal had confirmed everyone's suspicion that he wanted it, while also confirming he knew he couldn't take it openly. He had been caught in the gap between what he was and what he could publicly admit to being. The conspirators saw this scene and drew their conclusion. Caesar wanted to be king. If they waited, he would find a way. They couldn't wait. The conspirators had no plan for what came after. They believed,
and this is almost impossible to understand from our distance, that killing Caesar would be sufficient. That the Roman people would see what had happened and simply resume normal republican operations. What actually happened was Mark Antony read Caesar's will at his funeral. Caesar had left 300 sesterces, roughly 3 months' wages, to every single Roman citizen. Every one of them. He had left his private gardens on the banks of the Tiber open to the public permanently. The man who had been called a tyrant had, in death, given the city's ordinary people something no senator had ever given them: money in their hands and land under their feet. The crowd rioted. They burned the Senate building. They chased the conspirators out of Rome. Brutus and Cassius were dead within 2 years. Cicero was dead within 2 years. And the man who emerged from the chaos was Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old heir, who would spend the next 40 years dismantling every remaining vestige of Republican government while maintaining every Republican form, who would become Augustus, who would be worshipped as a god.
The conspirators killed Caesar to prevent a monarchy. Within 15 years, Rome had its first emperor. The assassination didn't save the Republic. It just meant the man who completed its replacement was more patient and more careful about maintaining the costume that Caesar had thrown off. Caesar was killed for his honesty. Augustus succeeded through performance. History rewarded the performer. Caesar had to die not because he was dangerous, but because he was honest in a system that could only function through collective dishonesty. The Senate didn't represent the Roman people. It represented a few hundred wealthy families who had been managing Rome's affairs for generations. Their power depended entirely on the legitimacy of the republican system. The moment Caesar said, clearly, repeatedly, undeniably, that the republican system was over, he didn't just threaten their positions. He threatened the story they told themselves about why they deserved those positions. You can survive losing power. It is much harder to survive losing the story that justified your power in the first place. Caesar made the mistake that brilliant people make in political systems throughout history. He assumed that being right was enough, that demonstrating clearly and undeniably that the old system no longer worked would lead people to accept the new reality. He didn't understand, or didn't care, that people will defend a useful fiction with extraordinary violence before they will accept an inconvenient truth. The 60 men who stabbed him were not defending the Republic. They were defending their right to keep pretending it still existed. And Caesar, who had outthought every opponent for 30 years, could not outthink that. Because that is not a military problem, not a political problem. It is a human problem, and it is as old as power itself. After Caesar died, his body lay on the Senate floor for 3 hours. Not one friend came. The senators had fled. The slaves who had accompanied him eventually carried him home in a litter, one arm hanging out the side. This was the man who had conquered Gaul, who had ended a civil war, who had canceled the debts of tens of thousands of ordinary Romans, who had survived dozens of battles and 2 assassination plots before this one, who had, in his will, left money to every citizen and his gardens to the city. He lay on that cold floor, alone, for 3 hours, because the men who had called him friend were too frightened, or too complicit, or too relieved to come. 2,000 years later, his name is still the root word for emperor in multiple languages. Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar. The title outlasted every institution that tried to contain him. The system he built, the imperial system, the one-man rule he refused to disguise, ran for another 500 years in the West and another 1,500 in the East. He built something that lasted. It just couldn't hold him while it was being built. Some things are like that.
Here is what I want you to think about. If Caesar had played the game, if he had worn the costume, maintained the performance, pretended the Republic still worked while quietly consolidating power the way Augustus did, would Rome have gotten something better? Or was the Civil War, the Empire, the end of the Republic, inevitable no matter what Caesar did? Was there any version of this story where the Republic actually survives? Drop your answer in the comments. There is no right answer, but the question is worth 2,000 years of argument. And if this kind of history is what you're here for, subscribe. There is more coming.